So this evening's talk, Crossrail's experience of geotechnical baseline reports, a client's perspective. Two speakers, John Davis and Mike Black. John is an engineering geologist who has been working in geotechnics since the mid-1980s, mostly as a consultant and designer, but with periods working for contractors as well. About a third of that time has been spent working on tunnelling projects. In the mid-90s, John was seconded into London Underground for a couple of years to run a research project into impact of rising groundwater on LU infrastructure. For most of the last 10 years, John has worked almost exclusively on Crossrail, where he was seconded into the Chief Engineers Group. During this time, he has been closely involved in the production of all of Crossrail's geotechnical baseline reports. When Crossrail construction started, he had an overview role for any in-ground issues that arose east of Farringdon. This often included assisting individual project teams in assessing geotechnical baseline report-related compensation events. John is a partner at Geotechnical Consulting Group, where he has worked for the last 10 years. Mike Black. Mike is a principal geotechnical engineer with 30 years' experience, primarily spent in the tunnelling industry on projects that include the Channel Tunnel, Jubilee Line Extension and Crossrail. He is currently with Transport for London, working on a number of TfL projects, including Crossrail 2. During his 20-plus years on Crossrail, where he held the role of Head of Geotechnics, he was involved in all the stages of its development, from early feasibility design, the passage of the hybrid bill through Parliament, detailed design, and ultimately construction. Mike held technical authority for all geotechnical matters on Crossrail, and his responsibilities included the design and procurement of Crossrail's ground investigations, defining the geotechnical requirements and standards during design, as well as geotechnical oversight and support during construction. So I think given that experience, they're going to give us two excellent talks tonight. The floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. The title's up there, the tagline, which Ivor just mentioned, a client's perspective. It's very much our perspective. We're trying to be objective with the stuff that we're presenting. But I suppose the challenge will be, perhaps I should have waited until the conclusions, it will be interesting to see a contractor's perspective on this as well. So the invitation's out there to try and get a different view, perhaps. It's not a visually exciting presentation, I'm afraid. There's lots of words, but hopefully the content will keep you enthralled. So this is basically the format of the presentation. I'll start off by explaining what a GBR is. Probably most people here will have heard of them at the very least, but I'll try and explain exactly what they are, what they're intended to do, how Crossrail adopted them, and by that I mean how contractually did we implement them within the contracts. Types of conditions used in Crossrail GBRs, so what did we baseline, what didn't we baseline? How did Crossrail organise its GBRs, and by that I mean how were they formatted, what was the structure of the documents. There's a bit of discussion after that, and then a little bit at the end as to who we feel are the right people to actually write GBRs. I'm starting off with acknowledgements. It's probably important to get this sort of said at the start. We want to thank Crossrail Limited in particular, because they've given us access to all the data to actually analyse and review and actually see what the performance was like on the project, and also permission for John to publish the paper and for us to present here this evening. Arup were very instrumental, in particular Alison Norrish, at the outset of this exercise on Crossrail. Her experience and guidance really helped us kind of form the way that we were going to construct these things and actually implement them. And lots and lots of other people, all the Crossrail designers, the consultants, the client team members that were involved in this. There were a lot of people that were party to actually producing these documents. So firstly, what is a GBR? Well, the purpose of a GBR, Geotechnical Baseline Report, is to establish the allocation of in-ground risk between the employer and the contractor. in relation to the ground, precisely what it says really. It does this, and it's a contractual document, it does this by including contractual statements, which are the baseline statements, and John will explain exactly how those are constructed later. And these define the relevant geotechnical or geological conditions that the contractor can expect to find during construction. And by expect, I mean where the baseline is set. With Crossrail tried to set the baselines at what could reasonably expected to be encountered. If the conditions are found, and this is how you actually use the documents as a measure, if the conditions are found to be equal to or better than a baseline, then the contract value is unaltered. If the conditions are found to be worse than a baseline, and importantly, the contractor can demonstrate that it's cost them in terms of time or resources, then a compensation event is triggered and the normal contractual process then follows. So what is a GBR? It basically has two principal purposes. At tender stage, the intention is that the GBR is used by tenderers as a common basis for pricing geotechnical and geological risk. So it kind of sets, precisely what it says, a baseline so that all the bidders are pricing against the same conditions. They may have their own views on what the actual ground conditions are like and how they feel they may vary from the baseline, but at least it sets a consistent level playing field. It has another purpose though. Post-contract award, the GBR is used to judge the validity of any compensation events that may arise as a result of the works. So it's used as a measure for ascertaining whether or not a compensation event is actually triggered or not. The baseline statements establish what's foreseen, and foreseen is in brackets because it is only a view, and unforeseen in relation to the ground conditions as they affect construction. Importantly, they should only cover issues in the ground which could adversely impact on construction. I've seen GBRs that try to cover every single geotechnical parameter under the sun, and many of those are irrelevant when it comes to the performance of construction and whether or not it's actually going to affect the way the contractor implements the work. So they should only cover those critical factors that potentially can have a bearing on the way the works are undertaken. Baseline statements, they must be concise, they must be measurable. There's no point in having statements that you can't measure later on, because then how do you assess whether or not a compensation or whether or not loss has been suffered? They must be clearly defined. They're not necessarily geotechnical facts, and they can be used to position that risk boundary wherever the employer wishes it to be. So if an employer is particularly risk averse, he can set a baseline at a more extreme position. If not, and as was the case on Crossrail, the intention was to fairly, as far as possible, to fairly set that risk boundary, then that really should be done, in my opinion. And the following point makes that. In practice, Crossrail baseline statements, they're almost always based on what we considered to be a reasonable and realistic view of what the contractor could have expected to find during the works. This is a really important point, the next one. GBRs are not the basis for a tender design. They're not interpretive reports. They're not the interpretive reports, and all of the geotechnical fact will exist in either the site information or in the data room or wherever that might be. These post-contract awards, they exist solely to determine whether or not a compensation event has occurred. So why did Crossrail adopt GBRs? Guidelines, the concept of GBRs are an American initiative, and they were first published in 1997, an ASCE initiative produced by the Technical Committee on Geotechnical Reports in the Underground Technology Research Council. They were later updated in 2007, and that's, as far as I'm aware, is the most current version of the guidelines. And they do what I've just said. The intention was to kind of set a contractual basis for in-ground risk. In the UK, they were actually implemented as part of the Joint Code of Practice, so the JCOP, that came out in 2003, which was an initiative triggered by the Association of British Insurers and the BTS, because there had been a number of particular incidents in the tunnelling industry in this country and abroad that were making insurers, in particular, very nervous about insuring major projects. So there was a realisation that there needed to be some way of kind of dealing with this risk and making sure that it was apparent and considered within the contracts at an early stage. So that's basically the basis on which GBRs have come into being in this country. The JCOP itself states that contract documentation for tunnel works shall include the geotechnical baseline conditions prepared by the client, or shall require each tenderer to submit with their own tender their assessment of geotechnical baseline conditions. And the requirements of which should be fully defined and fully described in the contract documentation. John goes on to explain in a little while exactly how they fitted into the overall contracts. Crossrail were very keen to show that we were complying with the JCOP and those particular requirements, and we produced a JCOP compliance statement. This was a live document that was updated every 6 months or so during design development, during the procurement process, and into the early stages of construction. And it's a big document that's broken down clause by clause and shows how the design was developing and how we were aligning the works with the requirements of the JCOP. And the GBR ones, if you want to go and look afterwards, specifically relate to clauses 7.2.5 to 7.2.8. This is a bit of shameless promotion for John here. He asked me to actually do this because he wanted to maintain a certain amount of modesty, I think, so I'm doing it for him. The Crossrail Learning Legacy website has a version of this paper, this presentation on it in the form of a paper. John's told me to tell you that to search under his name, you'll find it much easier than if you try and search under the title. And there are lots of other papers that John's written that you might be interested to look at the same time. Honestly, it's a fantastic resource. There's lots and lots of technical papers. There's lots and lots of commercial stuff, financial stuff, a lot of output that's come from the project. So I invite you all to have a look at that if you haven't done already. And I think this is where I hand over, don't I? We go back. Yeah. You want to talk about it some more?
Yeah. So all I'll add is, if you're the sort of person that likes to take notes, you needn't really bother if you don't wish, because virtually all the text, certainly all the subject matter, with the exception of one slide, which I'll tell you about, is in the paper. So you can listen at your leisure. And that web address will be on the last slide, so you don't even need to scribble that down. If you're standing at the back, by the way, please don't be shy. There's plenty of seats if you come down and round. I won't be offended. Right. It says, how did Crossrail adopt GBRs? That's not quite right. That's my first mistake. I should say where. So the JCOP defines tunnel works in that way, as you might imagine, all the things that could be associated with the tunnel, including shafts, including portals. And it's specifically for Crossrail, in one case, a Connaught Tunnel, including renovation of existing underground structures. So in practice, all Crossrail civils contracts had a GBR for them, including those that did not fit that JCOP scope. So you probably won't be able to read that well. There are 38 contracts listed up there, or 38 subjects of a contract, sorts of work. Only 32 contracts. All of those things had GBRs. Now the others involve no underground work at all. There's ground improvement, earthworks, and piling, and some of the station's advanced works over there on the left-hand side of the slide, some of those only included piling as well and no excavation. So there are GBRs in all of those. It's not just about tunnels. So 32 GBRs. Oh, and by the way, these were all written, because this may be relevant as we get later into this. All the GBRs were written in about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. It's quite a while back. So how? Rather dry slide. NEC3 for Crossrail, and in its unamended form, NEC3 has this rather old-fashioned unforeseen ground conditions clause relating to claims, where an awful lot hangs on an experienced contractor would have judged. And you can imagine that's very, very subjective and subject to potentially a great deal of argument. The purpose of the GBR is to try and remove some of that debate and make life a little bit simpler. So we have to amend NEC3 to be able to get around that. So the change in bold there is what's put into clause 12 or 60.1.12. So we basically that clause now only applies to conditions or types of condition that are not covered by the GBR. So if you find, I don't know, a nest of eggs in the ground that causes you a load of problems that's clearly not in the GBR, you will be arguing about it through this clause. And we add this clause, 12A. So this then is limited to the things that are listed in the GBR, stated in the baseline statements in the GBR, and you get a compensation event if your encounter, and it is an encounter during the construction, is more adverse than whatever the GBR, the baseline statements say in the GBR. So we end up with, between these two clauses, we end up with two classes of unforeseen ground condition. One relates to the GBR and one relates to the original clause 12. So in a clause 12, use the old-fashioned terminology case, there is another clause in 60 which sets out the information that would be used to debate the outcome of a non-GBR clause. And you can see there, the site is basically anything you can grab hold of, really. This sets some limits on foreseeability, but as you can probably imagine, this is still fairly subjective. But this only applies to 12 and not 12A. So what we end up with is a situation where we have two completely different sets of data to judge a compensation event, depending on which route it comes through. We have the GBR, and we have the site information, anything referred to in the site information, anything a contractor could reasonably expect to know. And it also means that there is no hierarchy between those two data sources. It can either be one thing or the other. Types of condition. Now, in the paper, if you're interested, there is a little bit of text on each of these with examples and explaining some of the pitfalls and maybe ways to write these things. I'm not going to go through them all here. It'll take quite a while. I'm just going to go through in the next few slides a selected few. But before that, we talk about the introduction, which is actually quite an important part of the Crossrail GBR. So it sets the context. So it explains a lot of things Mike explained before about it's not the basis for any of the design, they're not facts, and so on and so on and so on. But it does say that the baseline statements are aligned with the tender design. So Crossrail, maybe unusually in this day and age, is a very traditional form of procurement. It is entirely fully engineered design, drawings and specifications are handed over to the contractor, go away and build that. So all the contractor has responsibility for is temporary works. So we know what the tender design is in advance, and we can tailor the baseline statements to the forms of construction we expect to flow from that design. The third point on there, Mike's already mentioned, that the baseline statements are not fact. In a Crossrail GBR, they are reasonable and realistic, mostly reasonable and realistic attempts at the data, but they're not strictly facts. It's perfectly possible to move those risk boundaries into areas that will take the statements away from fact. And that has happened occasionally in the GBRs, but not very often. And obviously the fourth point there about that nothing in there allows the contractor to use the GBR to avoid any sort of responsibility for safe execution of the works. And finally, and it comes back to some of the points I was making a moment ago, that the GBR is not site information. In fact, in practical terms, this, I think, somebody will correct me if I get this wrong, I think this is in volume 1 of the, is it volume 1 or volume 0? Whichever, volume 1. Site information in an NEC 3 sense would be volume 3. Easy without those. Right, so in a Crossrail GBR, in fact, to go back to the beginning, when these were being, the format of these and how we were going to do them was being discussed right at the beginning, there was a big debate as to whether the GBR should just be a list of baseline statements, nothing else. Bang, 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 bang. The alternative was to provide a lot of contextual text that sits around those, and that argument won. And one of the reasons it won, you're all blurred now, so I'm going to put these back on. One of the reasons the adding the context one was that one of the requirements of the JCOP is to identify, for the GBRs to identify construction hazards. So we do that by explaining the context for those statements. But none of this text actually forms part of the baseline. We identify the baseline by putting it specifically in bold and italic text. So there's a lot of text, a lot of discussion, and then bang, 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 bold italic text. That's what you're pricing. That's what CEs will be measured against. Guys at the back, if you want to, don't be shy. Vicky, come and sit down at the front. So the only text in the GBR that applies when we come to assess the merits of a particular compensation event is the text in bold italics. Here's an example of an extremely simple baseline statement. And it is all about the strata sequence and what the tunnel works, or wherever this was taken from in this case, where they will expect to, where they can expect to encounter those particular stratas. So you can see it's fairly simple. A more complicated one, and I'm not going to read that out, is when you get situations, and we had this particularly at Farringdon, where the tunnel alignment, the platform tunnel alignments are at the same horizon as the Lambeth Group. There are lots of sinuous sand channels snaking around through all these Lambeth Group clays, and there are faults as well. So how do you tell the contractor what to expect? It's quite difficult, 3D form of text. That's probably our best attempt, and it's quite complicated. In practice, and I'll come on to the reasons why later, in practice, this sort of thing generally wasn't a problem. But nonetheless, we had to attempt to put something down that could be measured. And I don't expect you to be able to, well, maybe you can read that. I'm not going to go through this, but you can see this table in the paper. This just gives you a flavour of the sorts of geotechnical parameters that would be baseline for particular sorts of construction. So maybe I'll just talk through the top two lines. So the top line there on the left-hand side says London, it's basically the stiff clays. London clay, fine grain Harwich, and Lambeth Group. Plasticity, well, it doesn't really affect piling, it doesn't affect bulk excavation, it may affect SCL, and to an extent it may affect the TBMs. I'll come on to TBM baseline statements in a minute. And then same strata, undrained shear strength, clearly that affects the encounters the contractor might have with piling, with bulk excavation, with SCL tunnelling, and with the TBM tunnelling and the cross passages. So you can see there's a whole range of things there. So we're trying to focus what we're baselining on what might cause a problem in that particular form of construction. So London clay strength is an obvious thing. If you find it's very, very hard or very, very soft, you might have a problem with your excavation plant. We took a slightly different approach for the running tunnels, and this is not an especially important set of baseline statements, but you'll see why I've put them in on the next slide. We are basically just trying to get a flavour of what the ground is, just in case, effectively, somebody has to go in an intervention, planned or otherwise, out into the face, because these earth pressure balance and slurry treatment, earth pressure balance machines for the bulk of the Crossrail tunnelling are fairly insensitive to whether it's clay, sand, or a mixture of the two in front of the machine. So we set those sorts of things out on a chainage basis. So we'll say, chainage so-and-so to so-and-so, it'll be this, it'll be the other, or whatever. And then the only time, I think the only time, we baseline ground behaviour rather than, which is not something you can measure, but it's something you can experience, is to do with interventions. So this links back to the previous slide. And we've used this classification based on some work by Tazagi. And so if you expect to be able to have an intervention and go ahead of the TBM, and one of those things would have been baseline for a particular change length, if you find it's something else, you have the grounds for a compensation event. Groundwater and pore pressures. There's quite a lot of variety in the way we did these, depending on the situation. Clearly, in some contracts, it's much more important than others, but you can see from those examples, it's possible to fairly simply produce a baseline which describes some quite complex ground port pressure profiles. And obviously, excuse me, and in addition to that, we're always baseline permeability for every strata. As you'll see, obstructions are extremely important in this story. So, quite often we knew about significant obstructions, and where we knew about them, or we knew enough to be able to guess about them, we would write this sort of thing. There was baselining obstructions became a bit of a millstone in actual fact, because it's difficult to know where to stop. We ended up attempting to baseline all sorts of utility things, probably correctly, but it was hard work. And of course, we don't always know where they are, despite having drawings. And of course, sometimes Crossrail had moved them, and by the time the tender was let, they were somewhere else. So it did cause some difficulties. Nonetheless, you can see these are fairly significant obstructions we're talking about here. The point under the baseline statements there, we tended not to say exactly where these things were, particularly for piles, because what we don't want to happen is if we say you'll encounter 15 piles for whatever you're doing at this particular site, the contractor will price for removing 15 piles. And if we say, and they're exactly here, and they turn out to be somewhere slightly different, he has the opportunity not only to be take the money for the 15 piles, but get the money for another 15 piles. And there are examples where that would have been an opportunity if we'd said, and they are exactly here. So it was worth being silent on the, as a drafting tip for you. Don't necessarily be exact about where things are. And we also added, in the TBM contracts, and this crops up in a slide later on, we added some unknown piles, because we didn't always know, we weren't always confident about certain buildings that we knew were above the alignment. Is there going to be a pile under there? We just don't know. So we would say, again, avoiding the location, there are piles, so many piles of this strength and length in unknown locations, just to have a little bit of risk money in our back pocket. So the contractor then has to price for that. That's one of the occasions where we didn't baseline realistically and reasonably, perhaps. Probably should slow down. So we get to the meat of this now, really what happened. And the crux of some of these numbers you're going to see in a minute over the next few slides are based, in terms of percentages, based around that £4.25 billion value for effectively the GBR scope across those 32 contracts. Now, that number is a guesstimate. Let's be generous. It's a guess, because nobody knows what that number is. So there are several contracts where there is a significant below ground scope and a significant scope that only involve concrete works or above ground work. So, and you roughly know the contract value for that. How do you break it up? Only the contractor knows what the tender price was. So I've had to take a guess. So when you see the statistics on the next few slides, bear that in mind. So in all, and I think this is quite a low number, there were 321. Sorry, I'll just go back a second. So the reason I'm able to produce these statistics is there is a very complex and sophisticated document control system at Crossrail, and all of the compensation event notifications, NCEs, would be fed through this system, and they've all got certain fields that have to be filled out, including the clause they were claiming against, because there are 19 opportunities for compensation events. 12A is just one. 20 opportunities for compensation events. So I'm able to get somebody who knows more about databases than me to run a routine where I've said, please give me all the 12 and all the 12A compensation events and give me this data associated with them. I did that when the GBR works were almost complete, but not quite. So this isn't entirely the whole story, but it's close enough, I think. Bearing in mind, this paper was written probably the paper in the Thomas Telford book was probably written nearly 2 years ago, 18 months ago. So GBR works are all complete now, but they weren't then. So we have 321 12A compensation event notifications. Okay, and I think that's not very many across 32 contracts and £4 billion. But there you go. Of these, 182 were rejected, and at the time, 7 hadn't been resolved. So that leaves me with 132 compensation events that were agreed as to be compensation events, and then the process is estimates are produced and a value is agreed. But some of those are repeat occurrences, and you'll see what those are in a second, of a single thing. So if you bundle those up into being one compensation event, the total reduces to 102. Bearing in mind again, I'll stress it, 32 contracts and £4 billion and 102 notifications that were valid. So the total value of those 132 was 15.25 million. I'll come back to the footnote in a minute. And that's 1/3%, give or take, of my guesstimate, £4.25 billion. 6 of those, 132, were worth more than £1 million, the biggest being 1.6. And you can see the mean and median values there are very, very low. 16K is not very much at all. Now, the footnote at the bottom is really bumps up that 1/3% to, again, my guess, to something like 0.5%, because a number of things that didn't go to plan could easily have been successful CEs, maybe, may not have been, but they kind of got wrapped up into supplemental agreements between the project manager and the contractor. So, you know, let's do a deal, which is the project manager's prerogative. So if you tack those in, I reckon probably about 0.5% of GBR CEs might have been granted. So what were they all about? Well, so we've got 132. 72 of them were about obstructions. And actually, that's what drives that median value of 16K down to such a low value, because some of these are fairly inconsequential things. That's almost all man-made obstructions that we genuinely didn't know about. One of them was over £1 million, is one of the group of more than £1 million, and that involved some piles that were larger than they were supposed to be because of a geological feature, a drift-filled hollow, and it meant the contractor's proposed method of removing them just didn't work, so they had to be chipped out, in effect. 23 of them, this is one of the bundling up jobs, 23 of them relate to bentonite loss during D-wall construction. Basically, at the top of these D-wall panels, the bentonite was leaking into some backfilled cellars, in effect. That's all on one contract. One compensation event for each panel. And there are timing reasons and why the contractor went down that road and didn't bundle them into one. 16 related to the discovery of, I should have put contaminated material in quotation marks, hazardous materials, probably a better word. They're almost all related to finding asbestos, and they're almost all related to finding asbestos that had been buried underneath a building, which when we did the ground investigations existed, and then it was demolished, and then lo and behold, somebody had hidden a load of asbestos underneath it. Probably not a bad place to put it. So only really 9 of these encounters that resulted in successful compensation events couldn't be described as geological or geotechnical. And 4 of them, I should say, 4 of the 6 compensation events, not the 7. So 4 of the 6 are geological and geotechnical. Now, when I say that, it's never purely geological or purely geotechnical. With all things in the ground that don't go to plan, it's always been a combination of things that come together. And it's the same for all of these. But I've kind of, it's a subjective view, but there's a significant geological or geotechnical factor in the background in all cases. So this presentation has been given a couple of times privately recently, and I got mildly criticised in one of them for painting too rosy a picture because, of course, because I didn't have this slide in. Now, this is the slide that isn't in the paper, so if you want to scribble notes, this is the one to scribble against. So there are some ground-related compensation events that fell outside the scope of the GBRs, and you can see the statistics. 17 of values up to between 100 and 500k. This is almost all obstructions. 4 approaching £1 million, and you can see the reasons there. 1 related to some ground loss we had into a tunnel, into a catch pit excavation. It's quite a serious event. 1 related to 2 steel piles that we weren't expecting that one of the TBMs found, and that was really quite a big deal. So that lot comes to just shy of £11 million. So I think if I do the mental arithmetic, and I think that would bring you to something like 0.75% of the 4.25 billion. So, I'd be very interested to hear your views on this, because our views within the project was that these GBRs were quite successful. And that's not successful in the sense that Crossrail got a good deal out of them. I think it's successful in the sense that they worked well. So they were pretty straightforward to write once we got the hang of it. They were fairly straightforward to apply. And we think we got a good deal in the sense that they struck a reasonable balance between cost certainty and risk transfer. Because, of course, if we punt a lot of the risk to contractors, it costs us more money. Objectively, I've no idea whether this is a good deal or not, because nobody's published any data like this, and even if they had, it would be quite difficult to make a direct comparison, simply because the grounds are different, construction techniques are different. The GBRs are certainly not perfect, and there's a slide in a minute where I'll talk about where we perceived the weaknesses to be, but we think they were successful. And I think the key message here to take away is they're not successful because of any intrinsic quality. They're successful because there were no surprises in the ground because of the quality and quantity of the ground investigation data. There's just a huge amount. Yeah, I mean, how much, Mike, we're talking about in terms of value for GI overall? So 50, 60 million pounds over, I mean, the project, over 20 years. So, I mean, the project had its postponement problems. So we got to know the ground pretty well. Weaknesses. So in the bar, the BTS meeting, a few meetings ago, I was called by I'm looking at him now, a former chairman of the BTS, I won't name him, who said to me that you should say in your talk that geotechnical engineers shouldn't be allowed to write geotechnical baseline reports. And I have to say, I have some sympathy with that view. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I have some sympathy with it. I'm jumping off the... we'll come back to that point, but that's so that one of the criticisms that Damien made was we were very prescriptive about how things would be measured. We weren't very realistic, because particularly if you've got a tunnelling machine, there's something out there which you're encountering, and the tunnel machine always destroys it. So you've got this gap of knowledge. So how do you measure permeability if it's an issue when you're experiencing it in front of a TBM and you can't get in the ground? So we didn't cover ourselves with glory on that point. We'll come back to who writes a GBR in a minute, Damien. Baseline statements. Well, so I've just made the point. Baseline statements our baseline statements didn't always reflect how construction processes alter the nature of the encounter. And that's still a problem now. I'm working with GBRs and contractors at the moment. And nobody's solved this one. How do you do it? I don't know. We think we need to be a bit more creative. There's a very specific Crossrail problem we had with the environmental acceptance criteria that were put in place for Wallasey Island. Basically, we didn't get those criteria anything like in time. It came in late. So we ended with these woolly, not properly defined terms. We knew there was a weakness in the GBRs with these things, but thankfully it didn't actually come to anything in the end. But we could have had a problem with that. And the last one is really something that, last one on this slide, is really something that came to me when putting the presentation together as much as anything else, in that there are... the GBRs were put together by a team of 3 people, Mike, myself, and Helen Scholes. And we, as you'll see on one of the next slides where I talk about we need to have knowledge of the client's appetite for risk when you write these things, we didn't really get any guidance on that. So we've said reasonable and realistic. That we were guided by the JCOP in that, but nobody at Crossrail said be reasonable and realistic or be this way or be that way. So I think if we'd been 3 different people, that might have made quite a big difference to the outcome, to those statistics. I don't know. But it seems to me to be possibly too small a team. So, Damien, who should write a GBR? Well, I think these 6 things is something they would have to know. They'd need to know about the design. And bear in mind, we had 32 GBRs on this job. So you need to know about the design, you need to know about the ground conditions, and you need to know about those construction methods, how they all interact. You need to be able to look beyond the data in the ground investigation reports. So you need to understand the broad geology, the geological setting, and things that might occur that you didn't pick up in the GI. I think that's really quite an important one. You need to understand the limitations of that data. You know, if you end up with a problem with boulders, then and your borehole is only 100 mil diameter, how are you going to find out about them? You need to understand the construction scope, how things are built, and you need to understand the contractual point about how the GBR is actually applied. And you need to understand the compensation event mechanisms. And lastly, as I've just said, you need to understand the client's risk appetite. Now, I don't think any individual or group of individuals from a single organisation, whether that be client, designer, contractor, if these things are negotiated, is able to do all of those things. And if you have a contract like Crossrail with many, many GBRs, if there is a requirement for consistency, and there doesn't necessarily have to be one, but if there is a requirement for consistency, then that whole conundrum gets even more difficult. Crossrail's way around this was to get the designers, was to give them a GBR format, explain to them how it worked, and get them to basically write a first draft. And that gets us the design, the knowledge of the design, the knowledge of the data that's gone into the design, and the knowledge of the ground around the design. This would then be reviewed, revised, and sometimes substantially by the 3 of us. And that brings in the sort of overview, that should bring in the risk appetite knowledge, which was just ours really, the consistency if you have multiple contracts. And it brings in our case, because of our background on the job, it brings in the overview of all the GI and an overview of the things that might not have been picked up in the GI. GI for one site might tell you something about the strata, the same strata, and the neighbouring site that isn't in that particular package of data. And then in finalising these things, what we would be doing is talking with the contract formulation teams and the project managers sometimes. So we're bringing in, to an extent, the risk appetite in there, and also the knowledge, the detailed knowledge of the contract and how it would be administered. That's it. Now, before I go on, before we finish, I should say, baseline that. That is a picture. Everything in that photograph that is pale beige colour is grout. Everything else is River Terrace deposits, Thames gravels. And what you can see there is sand, clay, all over the place. So sometimes that's what you're up against. Geology is not simple. Thank you very much.
like that deserves a good airing of questions. And if you want to sit down, there are seats at the front. We're likely to have quite a few questions. Up to you. There are plenty of seats at the front, so come down. Right, we have a first question, please. Name and affiliation. Bill Gross.
Well, thank you very much, John and Mike. Very interesting presentation. Absolutely fascinating, very educational, I think, very useful for everybody here. I have two questions, if I may. First is, the purpose of writing GBLs is one, to be fair in the judgment of compensation events and allocation of risk as well. And the other is really to be efficient in the running of, let's say, claims or compensation events, so that you end up with a better result than if you've gone to court and argue about the grant issues. So I wonder, this is the first question, whether you measure how much was spent on the production of your GBRs and compare that with what you thought it might have been, what might have been the outcome had you not carried out GBR. My second question is that it was interesting that more than 50% of the compensation events were rejected. And I just wondered whether any of those led to any disputes or further discussions that may well have provided any lessons or learning on your views of your amendments, or either of NEC3 or of the wording of the GBRs. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll split that. I'll do the first one, and John could do the difficult one at the second bit. In terms of cost, no, we didn't monitor how much they cost to prepare, but I suspect it's a fraction of what would have been spent had we had to kind of go through a different mechanism to actually resolve these things. It was basically time. It was John, myself, and Helen's time, plus the time for the designers who were actually doing the initial draft of the GBR, plus the kind of the preparatory works in getting the format and the template and stuff together. But I suspect it would be a fraction of what would be spent otherwise.
So, I think I can remember your question, Bill. Yeah, so I think I'm right in saying that nothing has gone to adjudication. I think I'm not certain because obviously this isn't my role, but I think I'm right in saying the final accounts for all the GBR contracts have been settled or are about to be settled, and there's nothing gone beyond a negotiation with the employer. So there were certainly some things that went beyond an agreement with the PM and his contract administrator. Some things went to the employer, and I know because I was involved in helping the employer with some of them, but nothing's gone to adjudication. So in that sense, we saved a lot of money. The second part was about the rejections, 50%. Well, I probably can't answer that question properly because the rejection of those is really down to the PM. And if the PM picks up the phone and involves us, then I might have a view. But generally speaking, they didn't. But what I can say is I did see quite a few which were just easy to reject out of hand. You know, quite often it wasn't that unusual. Well, no, I'll be careful what I say. I certainly saw some examples where subcontractors who were back-to-back with their main contractors had been left to sort it out and just didn't understand the purpose of the document. So that the NCEs they were putting forward were just not very good. They're very easy to reject. And they either gave up or got some help and moved on. So I'm not sure is the answer, but I think you say 50% is a lot, but 321 across 32 contracts isn't very many, full stop.
There's another question behind Bill in the yellow.
Yeah, Chung Tin Lei, geotechnical engineer working for Horizon Nuclear Power. Thank you very much for a very interesting and very rich information presentation. I appreciate it particularly. My first question is on the relationship between the GBR and Eurocode 7, because we are very biased to Eurocode 7 in our design and planning for the nuclear power plant construction. It means that is it defined or obligatory in Eurocode 7 to do the GBR or not? And in which phase do we do the GBR relating to classic geotechnical reports in Eurocode 7, from factual to interpretative, investigation, and GDR, geotechnical design report?
The simple answer, there is no relationship between EC7 and a GBR. GBR is a contractual document. It's not a design document. I mean, it's based on, both things will be based on the same factual information to an extent. But remember, the GBR doesn't necessarily have to contain any facts. The employer may take a view that he wants to push all the risk to the contractor and phrases baseline statements in that way. But so there's no, going back to Bill's question, we did quite often come across temporary works designers, usually subcontractors, tier 2 and 3 contractors, who were using the GBR as an interpretive report. It says in the introduction, don't do that. They shouldn't have been doing it. They should have been going to the data. So no, there's no relationship between a design standard and a contractual a direct relationship between those two things.
So it leads to another question. We are all of our technical documents are very kind of verified and reviewed by the regulators, who is ONR, Office of Nuclear Regulations. So in this case, if it's not a technical, it's just contractual, do you think that the GBR will be reviewed by the ONR or not?
Whoever that body is, I didn't quite catch it, but if they have an interest in insurance and risk, then yes, but it's not a design document. So they may well have, as a client or a reviewing body, have an interest in what risks people are being allocated, the risks are being allocated to different parties, but other than that, it's not a design document.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I have a feeling Damien wishes to continue his debate about who's right.
Please do, Damien.
If you're down for Damien down here, please. He's bursting to ask a question.
Ooh. Thank you, Damien McGarrett-Covey. Thanks, John. I'll have to be careful what I say in the bar the next time. But I'm glad you justified the role of a geotechnical engineer again, so that's well done. But I won't continue that, but I'll continue maybe in the bar with you. But just picking up a little bit on a couple of points you've been saying, and back to something you said earlier about there was a lot of decision-making about whether the GBR should have an interpretation in it, and or just blank statements. And based on the comments you've just said about it being used for design purposes and being used, would you have any different opinion now again in terms of that and going back again, or is that still your view?
The contextual text really is a push, I think, to call it an interpretive report.
Yeah.
It is much more that the Thanet sand is this, that, and the other, and then the meat. If somebody was going to misuse this document as a design document, they'd be going to the baseline statements because it would say something about the grading, something about the phi angles, or whatever. So the rest of the surrounding text more just. It is literally puts it in context. Yeah, and, go on.
I was going to say that the GBRs do have a reference list at the back which contains references to all of the site information that was used to compile the document. So the contextual stuff helps to point the contractor to where the information that kind of helped to construct that statement comes from. So I think it's important that they understand what our thinking is as to why we've kind of said it the way we have.
And actually so we had an appendix at the back of the GBRs, Mike just said, which listed out all the relevant information that was actually already in the site information, but because we had so much of it, you quite often, I don't think, and contractors have said that you couldn't see the wood for the trees, and so it was a useful reminder to them to go and look at this particular document, this document wrap. It made it easy to find effectively the site information relevant to the GBR that's sat within volume 3. But it didn't work. I mean, a lot of times it didn't work. People were still using the GBRs for design. It's very, very common.
Okay. I feel that might continue in the bar. Another question.
I'm Michael Spencer. I was with the chairman of the insurers panel that worked with the BTS on the JCOP. My first question would be the 10.8 million you mentioned on your extra slide. Did you go to insurers for any of those unexpected events?
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I mean, it's
some of them I think looked like insurable events. So.
I think they probably were,
Yeah.
it's the truth, but I honestly don't know.
So that would have reduced the if you like. The second thing, did you anecdotally get any input from contractors to say whether they were able to refine their costs at bidding stage because of the existence of a GBR?
Only informally, yes. I think there was a Crossrail Lessons Learned conference with the Federation of Piling Specialists. It's quite a few years ago, isn't it?
About 3 years ago.
And there was a panel discussion there, and they had senior execs from a number of contractors. When you totted up, because the contracts were all basically joint ventures, when you totted up how many contracts they represented, these guys between them, there were 4 of them, there was something, it was something like knocking on for 20 contracts. So I asked the question, how did you find the GBRs? Were they useful? And I got a very positive response, and these are kind of senior guys. So what they were saying is, at a tender, their teams would come to them and say, we think it's going to cost this much, and the response back immediately would be, have you checked that against all the statements in the GBR? No, go and do it again. Yes, tick, okay, we go. So we got a very positive response. I think that basically they found them easy to use in that regard. Now, I can't speak for the contracting world. I'm sure people in here may have a different view. But that was the feedback we got that day.
Yeah. Next. Yes. The front here.
I'm Jim McClure, formerly with Mott MacDonald, and my interest comes because I have some involvement with the FIDIC ITA Emerald book, which is very much focusing on the place of the GBR. I have a question related to the update of the GBR every 6 months, and maybe it relates to the last question. When you updated the GBR, were you moving the contractual baseline? And if so, was the contractor taking more or less risk and adjusting his price accordingly? And I have a second question, which is, to what extent were the dimensions that you put for obstacles and some of the parameters there such that in fact the contractor was, the employer, Crossrail was accepting a risk, bearing in mind that anything up to that line, if the conditions were better than that, the contractor had an advantage. It was to his benefit. To what extent do you think that the few claims and the low value of the claims comes to the fact that in fact you priced a lot of things, or the contractor already priced a lot of risk anyway?
Should we split that again? I'll do the first one, you do the second.
Okay.
I'll try and answer the second as well. To be clear, it wasn't the GBR that was updated every 6 months. It was the JCOP compliance document. So it was the way that Crossrail tracked that they were complying with the clauses and conditions within the JCOP itself. And obviously, as design development progressed, the procurement process progressed, and we went into construction, the world changed, and more and more evidence and documentation was produced. So that's why that was a live document and updated. But the GBRs were a one-time only document. Although there is one condition to that. Sometimes the scope changed within contracts. So the scope would have been taken out of one contract and passed over to another contract, or things were done slightly different. And there were revisions to the GBR to reflect that. But this was all pre-tender. None of this was done after award.
So I've got an addendum to that, actually. So there was, I should have mentioned just in the weaknesses bit. So there was a 90-day period after award when the contractors, it was called Optimised Contractor Involvement, OCI. It's basically a VE exercise where the contractor could suggest changes. Now, generally those changes related to temporary works, temporary access shafts, that sort of thing, and for reasons I won't explain now, they generally, if they weren't in the location of the permanent works, they weren't covered by the GBR anyway. But there was one occasion where the whole method of construction changed radically, and I was knocking on the PM team's door saying we should change the GBR, and he just did not want to do it. So we should have changed that one. It didn't really cause too many problems in the end, but it could have been a horrible mix-up. You know, you have a GBR that's there for one particular form of construction. You change it radically, it's not necessarily very easy to apply. Your second question about obstructions, and yeah, well, we are trying to price that risk. Absolutely, yes. I think that was the gist of the question. So when we're talking about obstructions, if we know they exist, we try to baseline as closely as we can, with caveats about saying exactly where they are. But and I think that worked quite well. I mean, I think that's judged by that median value is only 16,000 or whatever. So lots and lots of obstructions were successful compensation events, but actually they were where we got the price wrong. It didn't really amount to much cost.
Yeah.
I think does that answer your question?
Another one in the middle on that side somewhere. There we go.
Tom Robinson, London Bridge Associates. You've partly answered my question in your last statement. Previous projects I've worked on have had a GBRB and a GBRC, where the contractors had a fairly active involvement in suggesting amendments to the GBR baseline statements on both a commercial basis and this is easier to measure against. This is easier to baseline from that point of view. From a client's perspective, do you see that as effectively a hiding to nothing, or would you encourage that sort of GBRB, GBRC type staging in the future?
I think that's an option, and it's certainly something that's described within the original GBR document from the ACSC. I think for Crossrail we did look at both options. Being D&B, contractors, clients' design, I think we kind of felt that producing the document ourselves with recognition of what we wanted to be constructed was the way forward. I think in a design and build environment, I think a negotiated document is probably a better way to go. Yeah, I've no experience of doing it the other way. I know that the way that we did it worked very well for us, but I don't have a view as to whether one way is better than the other necessarily.
But Crossrail had the luxury of a fully engineered design and a great deal of ground investigation information, so it made life very much easier for us.
I think there's one more question. Here somewhere. At the back, Paul.
Paul Perry from Houston. Do you think, looking at what's with Crossrail and the GBRs you produced, you talk about man-made obstructions there. Do you think the GBR should have a section in there that distinguishes what is permanent and temporary works, and therefore the JCOB be updated to make that clear? The sort of thing I'm thinking of is, I work for MTR in Hong Kong, where we were deliberate to expose and record temporary works proposed by the contractor to be left in the ground, and they were recorded, so that when we drove the adits below the stock exchange between Hong Kong Station and Central Station, we knew where the tower crane bases and the piles that were temporary works were, and therefore we could choose the route of the adits.
So you're talking about effectively the project's own temporary works as obstructions?
Should the GBR give a warning that that's information you don't have?
We didn't have too many examples where that would apply. I think it's a good idea, clearly. The only equivalent thing I can think of is we had a section in the GBRs about filled ground as opposed to made ground in a GI sense, where there were some contracts where a contractor would come along and do some work, typically do some piling for a box, do some excavation, clearing obstructions probably, and then backfill that excavation for the next contractor to come along. So we made those, we said you will find this particular sort of backfill. But as a matter of principle, absolutely. The Crossrail, because the Crossrail GBRs were based on the tendered drawings, unless there was a particularly prescribed piece of temporary works, like for instance grouting the RTD above a shallow tunnel, those temporary works would have been held within the GBR. But any other temporary works, for instance, hitting obstructions with TAMs, wouldn't have been a GBR issue. They could easily have gone through a 12 route because there's a big obstructions register, but it wouldn't have been a GBR claim if your TAM hits a well or something and causes a problem later on.
And your point about the drawings, there were very few drawings that actually had any prescribed. It may say ground treatment required, but it would be as generic as that.
Off the top of my head, I think of 3 locations.
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
So if you were considering putting warnings in the GBR, were there areas that you couldn't investigate? So there might be buildings that, so there might be buildings that weren't vacated at the time of the site investigation.
So
and
the
you
asbestos
deliberately put in
point.
the GBR areas that you couldn't investigate that the contractor had to pick up as supplementary.
I'm not sure you'd put it in as a warning. I think you'd have to take a stab at baseline in it. So you'd have to use your knowledge of the surrounding area or of other buildings, typically the same as the one in question, and have a go. I don't think the GBR is the right place to say that there may be something here, because then that's not a measurable and definite baseline statement.
And of course, you've always got the opportunity of the site information anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you.